So we got a bunch of people coming in right now, so we'll get started. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so overwhelmed and so touched that so many of you are here tonight and that so many of you continue to pour into these events and support writers like Ariel, who may have otherwise been on book tour, and these locally owned independent bookstores that many of which are struggling in the COVID economy. So the fact that you are here tonight supporting writers like Ariel, writers like myself, bookstores like the one that brought you here tonight, just says everything about the devotion of readers out there across the South, across the country, but especially here in the southern part of the United States. My name is Wiley Cash. I am the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Prize from the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance. I am also the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and I am a novelist myself. And I am your host tonight for Reader Meet Writer. SIBA is an organization that stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. SIBA represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores all across the Southeast. And so by being here tonight and supporting SIBA, you're supporting these bookstores. And perhaps you are here tonight because you saw this event, you read Ariel's book, you saw this event on your bookstore's website or their Facebook page or whatever the case may be. If this book sounds like something you'd be interested in, she's got, I think, 3 other wonderful books as well, historical fiction in a similar vein. Please consider purchasing her books from the bookstore that brought you here tonight and not that obscure website named after a river whose name we will not say this evening. So tonight's guest is Ariel Lawhon. We have another event coming up on Thursday. We will be hosting Thursday, February 11th in 2 days at 7 p.m. this exact same time. We'll be hosting journalist Jerry Mitchell. And Mr. Mitchell has written a book called Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. And this book is about Mitchell's search for justice, Mitchell's search for truth, and how really good investigative reporting can bring about justice that is long overdue. So this is a pulse-pounding book. This is a culturally relevant book. So I hope you all will join us Thursday evening at 7 p.m. for Jerry Mitchell and his book, Race Against Time, a reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. But we are here tonight to talk with Ariel. She is a critically acclaimed New York Times bestselling author of historical fiction. She has a number of critically acclaimed and successful novels, The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress, the hardcover of which I would argue has one of the great jacket covers of all time. She is also the author of Flight of Dreams and I Was Anastasia. And she is here tonight to discuss her book, which is still in hardcover, codename Helena. I think I said that right. Helena.
Yes,
close enough.
Helene.
We'll discuss that in the conversation. Her books have been translated into numerous languages, and they have been library reads, One Book, One County, Indie Next, Costco, and Book of the Month selections. She lives in the rolling hills outside of Nashville, Tennessee, with her husband and 4 sons, and she splits her time between the grocery store and the baseball field. And we were talking at the top of the show in the green room that she is at work on 2 projects right now. I'm not going to ask her what those are. But Ariel, it is a pleasure to see you virtually. It's been a while since I've last seen you. I think the first time we were in person, The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress had just come out. And I want to say at the top of the show that I met you online years ago when you and Mary Beth Whalen had the She Reads book club going. Mm-hmm. And you were working on a book then. And your doggedness and dedication and the resultant success is just wonderful. And if there are any writers out there watching tonight, your story would be one they would be well served to look into and to model themselves after. So can you tell us a little bit about what this book is about, and then tell us a little bit about the historical figure Nancy Wake?
Yes, of course. And thank you, Wiley. Thank you so much for doing this. It's great to see you again. It has been a number of years since we've been in the same room. And thank you so much to SIBA as well. SIBA is one of my all-time favorite organizations. And actually the very last event I got to do before the world locked down was a SIBA event. And I loved it. And I love the organization. And I'm so grateful to be here tonight. But yes, as you said, the new book is Codename Helene. And it is based on the true story of a woman named Nancy Wake. It is actually set in World War II. And it's funny, I did this because I swore I would never write about World War II. I thought there were so many of them. I thought all of the really amazing stories had been told. But if you're a student of history, you learn quickly that there are millions of untold, worthwhile stories. And this one came to me sort of in an odd manner. I was on book tour for my second novel, Flight of Dreams, and I was sitting in a hotel room in Buffalo, New York, all by myself, waiting for an event. I actually think I was the only person in the entire hotel, which was a little creepy. And I got an email from the mother of an old friend. And this email very bluntly said, Ariel, I don't know if you've ever heard of Nancy Wake. She's one of our Australian heroes, and she would make a great subject for a novel. And by the way, if you don't write about her next, we can no longer be friends. To be fair, my own mother would tell you I'm terrible at doing what I'm told. So I wrote I Was Anastasia next. And as soon as I finished that novel, I came back to it I came back to Helene and was astonished at what I found. It was unlike any other World War II story I'd heard. There are any number of female spies in World War II, and they did phenomenal things. But Nancy Wake was the only female military leader that I came across. And her story sort of flipped the script on what we think of women doing World War II. I'd never read a story before where a woman went off to war and she left her husband behind to hold down the fort, where a woman was airdropped into a battlefield and was revered and respected by all the men she commanded. It was astonishing to find this woman so far ahead of her time in this war, and I absolutely fell in love with her story.
Can you tell us a little bit about what made Wake exceptional? How did she arrive at these opportunities and these assignments when it was so uncommon? And then maybe on a personal level, what drew you to her story?
So Nancy Wake and I have very few things in common. She is much bolder and bawdier and brassier than I will ever be, I'm afraid. But we both left home at 16. She left Australia at 16 and went off to travel and work. And I left New Mexico at 16 and went off to travel and work. And there was something about that intrepidness that we shared that drew me to her. And the thing about Nancy, the reason I'm convinced why she found herself in all of these situations where she had opportunities most women weren't given, is she was just an exceptional liar. She could charm her way, lie her way into or out of any situation. For instance, she sort of conned her way into a job as a freelance reporter for Hearst newspapers by pretending that she could read and write fluent Egyptian. And she couldn't, but she passed the test by transcribing a section of a book in Pitman shorthand. And the interviewing editor thought it was amazing, and he hired her on the spot. And that's how she ended up in Paris at the outbreak of the war. And it was there, of course, that she met her husband. And no sooner did they get married than the Germans invade France. And Nancy was faced with the choice that I think everyone at the time was faced with. You have to do something or you stand by and watch it happen. And she was not going to stand by. So she began working with the French resistance and became so good at that. She then had to flee the country, but she wasn't done fighting. So she went to England and joined the Special Operations Executive. And because she was so bold and so brassy and could speak fluent French, they flew her back in. And that's how she ended up as a military leader acquiring weapons for the French resistance.
So is there one story, that all sounds and is so fascinating, but is there one story in the book about her that you could point out, you said she was bold and brassy, and there's some barroom scenes, and there's some rough and tumble stuff. But is there one story that you could point out and say, this story in the book is really emblematic of the woman that I wrote about in the book?
Yes, absolutely. The first one that comes to mind, and this really happened, most of what I put in the book really happened, is the first morning after Nancy wakes up in the middle of the forest, and she is surrounded, as she calls it, by 200 sex-starved Frenchmen. And she is the only woman within probably 100-mile radius. And it's her first morning as military leader. And she knew she had to get their attention and she had to get their respect immediately. But she's also human and she had to go to the bathroom. So there are no facilities. She goes off to the creek and she knows that men are following her and she knows what they're up to. So she pretends to use the restroom, and as soon as the bushes start rattling, she stands up and she fires several rounds into the ground near those rattling bushes, and these Frenchmen flee. And that's the point at which she gathers them together and she basically says, I will have my privacy and you will respect me. And if you want 1 cent, if you want 1 bullet, a single gun, you will do as I say and you'll never pull that crap again. And she was really clear that she wanted their respect, not their lust, and she got it. And they never messed with her again.
That's amazing. So there are all these different time shifts in the novel, taking place in different times throughout the war and different times in her life. And you do a great job of tracking them. But as a writer myself, one thing that I thought would have been difficult to do as a writer that you pull off so gracefully is not only tracking these different time sequences and threading them into a single narrative, but the novel is narrated first person, which is to say Nancy is telling us her story. Mm-hmm. And the whole novel is narrated in the present tense, as if all of it is happening in the exact moment, which clearly it's not because of all these time breaks. But I have my suspicions about why you may have done that, but can you talk about the challenges of that or the reasons you made decisions like that?
Yes. Okay. So first, when it comes to the different narration, one of the first things that I learned about Nancy was one of her very first assignments for Hearst newspapers. She was sent to Berlin to interview the newly appointed German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. 8 years later, she kills a Nazi with her bare hands. And I was struck by this contrast of she interviews Adolf and is appalled by him. 8 years later, literally kills one of his minions with her bare hands. But the question is, how do you become that? How do you become a woman that goes from one to the other? And to me, the best way to do that was to have these alternating timelines. So I begin, as you do, in action. Literally, the first scene is her getting dropped out of an airplane into the forest. And the next chapter, we go back 8 years and we alternate back and forth between them. So you see the progression of military leader and how she became that woman. That's how I answer the shifting narratives. People are always curious. When it comes to present tense, several answers really. First, quite simply, is that I find it's my natural voice. I think most writers sit down and something comes to you easily. And I've written in past tense, I've written in present tense, I've written in third and first, I've written all over. Present tense comes easily to me. But the biggest reason was I find if you're going to write a thriller or if you're going to write a book set in the past, you need a sense of immediacy. And there's something about, particularly set as far back as World War II, it can feel like, oh, that happened. It's already done. I'm just reading about it now. Whereas if you shift the tense, you give your reader this sense of it's happening right now. Right now, it's happening to this character, and I have to stay here to catch up.
Yeah.
And it seemed to work well for the story. And I don't know, I'm sure you're this way. You kind of have this gut sense of when something works and when it doesn't, and you shift it around until you go, oh, I feel it now. It works.
Yeah, and if there are writers out there listening, those kind of craft things are really invaluable. And I want to say real quickly, if you have a question for Ariel, or if she said something, or you have a question about research, which I'll also ask about in just a moment, go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type in your question for Ariel. Make sure you mention your name and the name of your favorite independent bookstore, your home bookstore, so we can say both your name and the name of your favorite bookstore on the air, and I will give her your question at the end of the show. So just go ahead and put those in. Don't wait, and I'll look through them at the end, and we'll go from there. But I really like what you said, and I've never thought about it that clearly, Ariel, when you said, when you're writing about the past, especially something like World War II, it does feel as if all those stories have been told, which your novel very clearly proves they have not. But sometimes writing about the past, which I've done, can feel very dusty and very distant and very already decided. Mm-hmm. But your novel never feels that way. It's always in the moment. There's so much action. There's so much tension. And what I love about it is, Nancy Wake is always becoming, mm-hmm. even in the past tense, which is written in the present tense, she's still becoming. She's still cycling toward becoming the woman who eventually does kill a Nazi with her bare hands, which that's how you should lead every book talk. At the top, in this novel, Nancy Wake kills a Nazi with her bare hands. But it does, and what you so smartly cut away from is, because it's happening in the moment, the narrative never drags, where Nancy reflects like she would if this were written in past tense. Like, how does she feel about killing the Nazi? Who cares? Let's just make it happen. And so it is like very propulsive, very streamlined, very direct, and very clean. And it was impressive to me that you were able to do that using the same verb tense, despite these various storylines, the timelines. It was really cool, Thank you.
Definitely one of the things that I do anytime I sit down to start a new project, I have a notebook, and literally I draw a line down the middle, and I have my pros and my cons. The pros are, here are the things that I think will make this a strong story. These are the reasons why I'm drawn to it. This is why I'm going to write this book and why I'm excited. And on the cons side are, here are all the reasons why this is not going to work. Here are all the reasons why this is going to be hard. Here are all of my challenges with this particular story. And my goal throughout the entire writing process is to turn every single one of those cons into a pro by the time I'm done with the manuscript. And it can be as simple as, there are a lot of World War II stories. How do I make this one fresh and different? Or, this happened so long ago. How do I make it feel immediate? And that's the fun part for me, the puzzle, to go, ooh, I have all of these challenges. Mm-hmm. That's the part I love. It's like a game I play with myself.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a great idea. So people, when you write a historical novel, people always want to know about research. And I'm wondering if you can share an exciting story from your research, or if you don't want to, or one's not coming to mind, can you share a moment when something about the plot or one of the characters really surprised you, where you knew you were going to seize on that moment to turn the narrative?
Oh, good question. Actually, I kept my research books out, and I've got them all here, all my little sticky notes. This is my favorite one. This is Nancy's autobiography with all of my notes. And this is why I don't get books from the library, because I underline and draw, and librarians, that hurts their feelings. So I buy them and I desecrate them at my leisure. Actually, I can share one sort of cut scene that I came across with Nancy. And it was one of a million things where you go, oh my gosh, this woman, like, I couldn't do that. Like, I would not be bold enough to do this. In her autobiography, she talks about this point in the war when the Germans had invaded France. And originally there was the occupied zone, which was the northern part of France, and the free zone, which was the southern part of France. And eventually, of course, there was no free zone whatsoever. And the Germans came in and they took everything. They took all the animals. They took all the food. But Nancy wanted bacon. She wanted bacon. She found someone to sell her this pig that she kept in a farm hundreds of miles away. And eventually this pig grows up, time to be slaughtered. Nancy's going to share the food with all of her neighbors. She has got to get it back from the mountains to Marseille So she loads it in 2 heavy suitcases and puts it on a train and ends up sitting across the way from a Gestapo officer. When they get to Marseille, she can't get the suitcases down. They're too heavy. So she cons him into not only getting the suitcases down, but carrying 2 suitcases full of contraband through the checkpoint. And nobody checked him because he was a German officer. And finally, he looks at her and he's like, oh my God, you have contraband in here. And she's like, I do. And you're going to go to jail with me if you tell anyone about it. They get through the checkpoint. He puts her bags down, walks away, and she goes home with 2 suitcases full of pork chops and bacon.
Oh, that's an awesome
I mean,
story.
you can't make that stuff up. You can't make it up. And it was one of those fun stories that hit the cutting room floor because it wasn't connected to anything else. It was just a great story. And
Jody
that,
Darlings.
yeah.
Did you come across any stories that were so awesome that they weren't believable enough to be fiction?
Yeah. Actually, during one of the early editing stages, my editor wrote to me and she's like, okay, this is really fun. And you can cite everything as it really happened. She goes, but Nancy kind of feels like a cartoon character, like a superhero.
Mm-hmm.
You had to make her more real. And that was, all of it was true. Everything that happened was true. For instance, the killing the Nazi with her bare hands. How many women could say that throughout the course of the war? It's one of the things she's most famous for. It's also one of the most unbelievable things that you hear about her. So there were these layers that had to be built. And so much of that happens during revision. You know how that is. You go, like, you have the story, then you go back and you add the nuance.
Yeah.
And it was a constant struggle of, this is amazing, I want to keep it. I also have to make it real and her feel deeply human.
Totally. We've got a bunch of questions that are coming in, but I have one more to ask you. I know, and she's probably watching tonight, Mary Beth Whalen, the author, novelist, is a close friend of yours. Mm-hmm. You also cite a couple of other writers in your acknowledgments for this book. Can you talk about the importance of finding and developing a writing community?
Yes, absolutely. I was actually talking about this with a friend of mine who's in the acknowledgments. Her name is JT Ellison. She's a phenomenal thriller writer, and she lives here in Nashville. So we get together quite often for writing retreats, or sometimes it's just margarita and queso, as you do. And it continually astonishes me that not all writers have that community. I tend to assume that everyone in this profession has built a community around them that is encouraging, that builds them up, that helps them. And it continually surprises me when I find out that's not the case. I was really lucky when my family moved back to Nashville, that Nashville's a writing hub. There are so many wonderful writers here. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you gravitate toward other writers as your friends. And after a while, they go from professional colleagues to personal friends.
Yeah.
And I'm an extrovert, so I need people and I need to talk through ideas. Some people, like my husband, for instance, he gets an idea, he processes it entirely on his own, and then he comes to his conclusion. That's not how I typically work. I'll get an idea and I have to sort through everything. And quite often with my writing friends, I will say, listen, I need your brain right now more than 2 years from now when you read this book. So I'm going to completely spoil it for you. This is how it ends. Help me get there. Walk me through the process of how I can do that. And that collaboration I find incredibly edifying. It feeds my creative spirit. I don't know many writers who want to be completely solitary, but I think there are probably some out there. But I would absolutely encourage any aspiring author to find 2 groups of people for your writing community. Find the people that are at your stage, whether it's first book, second book, whether it's published, unpublished. Find a handful of people who are where you are and grow up together in the business. And then find a handful of people that are a stage or 2 ahead of you, so that when something happens, or you're caught off guard, or you get published, or you're 5 books in and you're needing career advice, they can help you because they've been there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also career advice is really important. Like, we don't really have natural colleagues. We kind of toil away on things that are very private and very solitary, and we don't have people to like go grab lunch with or gossip with about the boss or whatever the case may be. So you make those writer friends, and it's so valuable to have somebody who speaks your language, who knows, the reality of royalty statements or whatever the case may be. It is so beneficial. So
yes. And somebody told me early on, your agent and your editor are not your therapist. That is not why they exist. Find writer friends that you can gripe with and sort things out so that you do not exhaust your professional colleagues as well.
Yeah. But those moments when you feel like they've become that, you're like, oh no, I've crossed the line, haven't I? I've been there. We have a ton of questions coming in. The first one comes from Kat, favorite bookstore, page 158, books in Wake Forest, North Carolina, just right down the road from me. Kat asks, who are some of the authors that you love to read and who have impacted your work? And I wonder, especially since you write historical fiction, can you talk about some historical fiction novelists who have had a big influence on you?
Absolutely. I always say that the author with the biggest influence, who I credit for becoming a writer myself, is Agatha Christie. In no small part because I read Murder on the Orient Express when I was 12. And I remember sitting there going, I didn't get it. I didn't get it. She gave me everything I needed to solve this mystery, and I didn't do it. And I don't know how she did it, but that's what I want to do. And I continually think back on her, and I've tried to introduce all of my boys to her. And some have taken to her and some haven't. And that's just how it goes. Yeah. I'm looking at my bookshelf here, actually, to answer this question.
That's always the question. You're like, oh my God, there are 500 writers I want to mention right now. Some of them are my friends and I can't remember their names.
An obvious one is Diana Gabaldon, because she's a master and her Outlander series is a masterpiece. I think of Diane Setterfield, whose two novels, The 13th Tale and Once Upon a River, were both spectacular, so different, but so wonderful. Deanna Rayburn is an author who writes historical fiction, and she is one of my go-to authors for rediscovering the joy of reading. It's not something you think about a lot, but writing used to be my hobby, and then my hobby became my job, and my job affects how I read. It's sometimes really hard to turn off the writer brain. I'm analyzing or I'm dissecting, and I have to remind myself, no, reading is the thing I do because I love it. Yeah. And Deanna always helps me love reading again. Oh gosh, Susanna Kersley. I have all of her books. I've read them all. Anthony Doerr, and oh gosh, there's Elizabeth Kostova. There's a million of them.
I was going to mention her. She seemed like somebody that you would be naturally drawn to. She lives up in Asheville, where you and I were several years ago. We've got another question coming in from Donna Joe. And Donna Joe's favorite bookstore is Memphis Novel Bookstore. DJ is what she goes by, DJ. And DJ is curious, how long did you spend researching before you began writing? And this is a question a problem I have with my last book. She writes, I discovered that I can't seem to wait to get busy writing. Do you have any advice?
I do. And actually, her question touches on something that I've talked about before, and I'm convinced this is how it works. There are two kinds of writers, and I think you're one or the other, and you're just born that way. There's the kind that want to get to the business of writing. They sit down at the computer and they are just compelled, and it's an adventure, and they write by the seat of their pants, and they don't know where they're going, and they love the process. That's the first kind. The other kind is the plotter, which is what I am, where I don't write a single word until I've done most of my research and I've plotted the entire book, and I now know how every scene is connected to the other. It's just the way I work naturally. However, my friends who are pantsers, I find usually, and I think most of them would agree, that they end up doing the majority of their hard work on the back end. Lots of revisions, lots of editing, lots of rebuilding. Whereas the plotters do most of their hard work on the front. They're figuring out what this thing is that they're going to write. But here's the good news, or bad news, however you look at it. You're going to suffer either way. Either way, you're going to have this mountain of work, but you get to choose where you want it, at the beginning or at the end. I choose to do it at the beginning. But what I would say, if you're stuck in the research rabbit hole, which is a real thing, it's okay to stop. And if you don't know what they called pantaloons in 1729, you don't have to know right now. I will constantly put brackets
Yeah.
in my work and I would say, look this up. And then I'll go on with my thought. And I actually have to force myself to do that because I love the research so much. I am constantly in danger of never actually writing the book. And I will get to a point where I feel like my brain is full of information. And then I make myself start writing. And if I don't know an answer to a question, I just bracket it and come back to it later.
Yeah. I've done that as well. Put the brackets in, and then you search the brackets, and all of your left out information shows up. Janine asks, bookstore is Majors and Quinn in Minneapolis. And this is a question that you touched on just very briefly in your previous response, but has your writing process evolved from book to book, or has it been mostly the same? Advice? Do you have any advice for writers getting started?
Yes. Well, mostly the same. And I frame this as my entire writing career has happened within the circumstance of motherhood. About the time I stopped having babies, I started writing books. So there were many years that I was writing early mornings, late at night, on the weekends. My first novel, you mentioned it, The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress, was written entirely on Saturdays. My husband was working long hours at the time, and he missed the kids, and I did not miss the kids by the time Saturday rolled around. So I would leave and he would have them for 8 hours. So it shifted depending on their ages, their needs. When I write has shifted. How I write has not, which is typically, I think this is from having so many children and oftentimes only having a small pocket of time. I need to know what scene comes next. And I need to know that my writing is not going to be wasted, that I'm not going to have to delete the whole thing. So I would know the last scene I wrote. I would know the scene I have to work on now, and I know how it's connected to the one that comes afterward. And that really keeps me sane throughout the process. It makes me feel like I'm building something I can keep. That's me. I'm sure other people work differently.
Barbara asks, how difficult was it to write about the historical figures that we all know about? Difficult in terms of making them part of the story and fitting them into the story?
Ooh, good question. I struggled with that the most with my third novel, I Was Anastasia. When you're writing about the Romanovs, there's a lot of material out there about the Romanovs. And my rule has always been, if I can verify it in history, I cannot change it. So like, for instance, my novel set on the Hindenburg. In real life, everyone in the novel really existed. If they died in real life, they died in the book. If they lived in real life, they lived in the book. So that helps. But there comes a point when you realize we can't really ever know someone from the past. If you're really lucky, you have source material, you have diaries or letters. But a lot of the time, you only have a caricature, something of a shadow from history that you have to build in. And that's the point at which I go, okay, what story am I telling? And what am I trying to say to the world through this story? And then I will build the character that suits that particular theme.
We have a bunch more questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, everybody. I'm so sorry. Lauren asked, Lauren's bookstore is Oxford Exchange in Tampa. She says, this book changed my view on historical fiction and showed me it can be fun and exciting. Are there any historical events or ideas you thought of writing about but ended up not pursuing?
Ooh, okay. Great question. I actually have one that for 2 books now has been, I'm going to do that one next. And then I come to the next and I'm like, oh, I can't do that one next. I'm going to do this one next. And it gets bumped down. Actually, my novel, I Was Anastasia, I was set to begin working on a book about Alcatraz, the famous 1963 escape from Alcatraz, where Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers broke out, disappeared, were never seen again. I had all of my research material. I had most of the story plotted, and I was going to begin the following Monday. But that Friday, I was poking around the internet and wasting time, and I stumbled upon just this tiny little anecdote that became I Was Anastasia. So there's always an idea. I have more ideas on my computer than I could ever write in one lifetime. And sometimes the biggest challenge is not what's the next book I'm going to write, but what's the next right book? What is the best idea to follow what I've done? I don't know. I think history gets a bad rap. It's not dry, it's not dusty. I think it's fascinating. And if you're looking for those ideas that kind of blow your mind, my best advice is go find a woman who lived it. Think, I don't know, insert moment in history. It could be anything, World War One. Go find the account of a woman who lived through it. This is my personal thing. I like female stories because they're less about the bullets and bombs and the big moments of history, and they're more about the emotions and the small betrayals and what it was really like to live through the nitty-gritty moments of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I like writing about female characters too, because I feel like women's lives, for various socio-political, cultural reasons, are so much more complicated and rife with tension than men's lives are, to be honest. My wife's life is much more interesting than mine is for those very reasons. Perhaps our last question is from Helen. Shout out to Copperfish Books, she says, in Punta Gorda, Florida. She says, since my name is Helen, I would love to know how Nancy Wake came up with her name, her code name. Did she select it, or was it selected for her for a reason?
It was selected for her for a reason. She had no control over it. I'm trying to think. Nancy Wake was her real name. Madame Andre was the name she used or was given to her by the British government as the military leader. The only one that she got to choose for herself was Lucienne Carlier. That is the first name that she assumed when she began working with the French Resistance. Helene was chosen for her by the British government. And then the last name was called the White Mouse. And that actually is the one given to her by the Gestapo because they could not catch her.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Ariel, and for answering my questions and for spending this time with us. Congratulations on the book and the paperback release and all the attention it's gotten, so well deserved. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. We had an enormous audience tonight. We have had such big crowds for these events, and there is a lot going on. So the fact that y'all chose to spend this evening with us says a lot about your dedication to literature and your dedication to the locally owned independent bookstore in your community. So please, if you're interested in Ariel's book, please support your locally owned independent bookstore and purchase it from them. And please join us on Thursday evening. We'll be with Jerry Mitchell. His book is Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. Timely and important. And we hope to see you all then. So until then, good night. Thanks for your support.
Thank you.